Hello, I'm Joe Ewens, and this is the Vixio Gambling Compliance Podcast. We live in a period of upheaval for gambling in the Asia-Pacific region. For a variety of reasons, different countries are taking radical new approaches to gambling regulation. In the Philippines, the nation's often controversial foreign-facing industry is set to be outlawed, while in Australia, a new era of compliance challenges is seeing operators staring down a potential advertising ban. Meanwhile, new opportunities are unfurling themselves in Thailand and the UAE, to name two. To help us detangle this knot of regulatory complexity, we welcome our contributing editor for Asia, Martin Williams, back to the podcast. Hi there, Martin. Welcome back to the show.
Many thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
So, makes sense for us to start in the Philippines, I think, for two reasons. One, that's where the most, I should say, exciting is maybe the wrong word, but tumultuous news is coming from. But also, you were recently there. So I think perhaps before we get into to what you picked up on the ground, what's the situation in summary?
Well, it's a strange thing. The Philippines has been far and away the most volatile of all the Asian markets in terms of regulated markets over the last 6 months to a year, and it's been a captivating and wrenching experience in a way, watching two sides of the gambling industry go in different directions. In the case of the online segments, we've seen an absolute disaster on the part of the foreign-facing online gambling sector, known as colloquially as POGOs, which have now, thanks to a pending order, an announcement and a pending order by the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., are set to be shut down forever from the end of the year, if not earlier. Now, we're still waiting for the text of that order to be released, and we don't know exactly what it's going to contain. Certainly when President Marcos gave his, to some people, a little bit shocking announcement at his State of the Nation address before the Philippine Congress, a lot of us thought, well, maybe, as always seems to happen in the Philippines, there's always an out for interested parties. There is the combination of the complexity of the situation, the complexity of the government handling of the gambling industry, as well, of course, creeping in the sides, the endemic corruption that the Philippines suffers, suggests that there may be a way out. However, we just don't know. It's possible it could be a lot harder in tone and in fact than we might expect. On the other hand, you've got the land-based sector, which is really just going great guns. It's recovering really quite wonderfully from a combination of the pandemics, impacts on tourism and on the closure of facilities, and of course on the various threats issued by the Chinese government to the Philippine government, to gambling operators, and to Chinese citizens who gamble in the Philippines or who work for Philippine operators. Despite all of that, the land-based side of things is going great guns, and as we'll discuss in a moment, it's also now hosting a remarkable explosion in gambling volume in the land-based, licensed or based online domestic-facing industry, and it's really quite a remarkable thing. And as Danny Stone, our colleague at Vixio, has pointed out in our outlook for Asia Online last week, that explosion is likely to catapult the Philippines into the top 10 regulated online gaming markets globally, which is an extraordinary thing. And the head of PAGCOR, the CEO of the gambling regulator PAGCOR, Alejandro Tenco, mentioned in his keynote address at that event that they were really quite proud of that performance, which was remarkable in a way, because up until that point, I hadn't had the impression that the Filipinos were particularly proud of their nascent, sort of recently developed domestic online industry. And again, we'll get that into a moment. Get into that in a moment. As I said, you've got these two different strands. You've got the online side with the POGOs going into the ditch. You've got the domestic side of the online market which is linked into the land-based market, and you've got the land-based casinos which are really going great guns, with new casinos on the way. Soler North, the sister property to the Soler property, Entertainment City, run by Bloomberry, is opening in a few weeks. You've got other properties planned for, a fifth property planned for Entertainment City, and also possibly for Boracay and Cebu. So really, the outlook for the land-based side of things in the Philippines is really remarkable, and it's a tonic compared to the lack of security and the uncertainty surrounding other developing land-based markets such as Japan and Thailand. I would simply add on the issue of the closure of the POGOs that this is not just a recent event, a recent decision that's come from the raids this year on several compounds, cyber scam compounds that were linked to former POGO licensees. This is years in the making. It's a product of all the violence, the kidnapping, the murders, the extortion, the filmed torture of Chinese gamblers or workers that were sent back to their family members in China by people preying on POGO licensees, and of course the pressure from Beijing. All of these things, plus the embarrassment of other parts of the government looking for tax revenue to be rectified from the POGO, all of these things built up, and we've ended up with this disastrous situation. Unfortunately, it has also linked up with this expansion of the Southeast Asian style human trafficking cyber compound phenomenon, which is at the moment still home to Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, which has sadly expanded to the Philippines in a way that seems to have taken a lot of people, including the authorities, by surprise, even though when you look at the size of these compounds, they've been basically hiding in plain sight and taking advantage of a lot of corruptible local officials, and probably officials a lot higher, as well as, in some cases, bribing immigration officials at the main international airport. We all know that story. And lastly, on that background issue, we have the saga involving the now infamous Alice Guo, who was an alleged Chinese national who went on to impersonate a Philippine national who became very wealthy, got elected to the mayor's post of a town in southern Tarlac province near Freeport, and became influential in the operation of one of the cyber scam compounds that was raided in March this year, I think it was. And not least because of her and her connections to another case in Singapore, her colleagues in the Philippines were recently jailed in Singapore's largest ever money laundering case. All of this has contributed to the expression POGO becoming synonymous with lawlessness. And I suspect that despite all of the good reasons for POGOs to continue as far as the government's concerned, President Marcos has said enough is enough, I'm done with it. And when you look at the response in the Congress to his announcement, people getting on their feet and giving him a minutes-long standing ovation, you know that the industry has had its time. At least the regulated industry has had its time. Still, we could be seeing something else happening there, and that is, depending on the wording of the order, we might still see exemptions made for service providers rather than the POGOs themselves, which is something, interestingly enough, that Alejandro Tenco, the boss of the regulator PAGCOR, himself suggested only a few weeks ago. So there is that possibility. We could also see exemptions made for the Cagayan Special Economic Zone, which is where all of this stuff started before PAGCOR took over regulation of online gaming, foreign-facing online gaming. And that's the state of play at this time. We don't know when the Marcos order will be issued, but it's going to be extremely interesting to see how comprehensive it is. In the meantime, as I mentioned, the national security issue, the espionage issue involving POGOs continues to bubble along. One of the most prominent anti-gambling senators in the Philippines, Riza Hontiveros, has requested that the National Security Council in the Philippines classify POGOs as a national security threat, which would greatly enhance their ability to crack down on them, including subsequent illegal operations, of which, if you believe the presidential office's agencies, still number in the hundreds nationwide. Like I said, hiding in plain sight. The last thing I would say on this issue is we know the expression October surprise in the context of American presidential elections. I'm just wondering if there'll be an October surprise for the pogo industry. I'm assuming that the statement will be made next month. We're recording this podcast on September 26th, so there's still some time. But I'm just wondering whether there will be some respite given to some part of the industry. What I heard in Manila 2 weeks ago is that people involved in the industry somehow think that maybe things aren't as bad as they seem. And if that intelligence is correct, we might be seeing some underhanded stuff or maybe some sleight of hand. In any case, it's been a fascinating 6 months to a year, and I have a feeling that the intensity of this volatility is going to roll on for some time yet.
You mentioned there that there might be an exemption made for service providers. I mean, what does that mean in the Philippines context?
Well, as it happens, less and less as time has gone on. I mean, at one point, PAGCOR had a fairly distinct licensing distinction between POGOs, which were, B2C operations, and B2B operations, which were other companies that were providing services for the B2C operations. But as time went on, it became clear that some of those B2B operations were themselves under the table doing B2C operations as well. And so there's been a kind of a meshing together of the licensing process, even though if you look at the website, there are still technical differences. So what Alejandro Tenco seems to have been implying is that it's possible that PAGCOR could continue to make significant revenue from foreign-facing online activity by licensing B2B operators where the Philippine-based service provider provides services to foreign operations that don't target Filipinos. That's what I think he was getting at. The impression I get, though, is that not many people have taken that option very seriously. I think what's clear from those in the Senate who have railed against the industry, and what's reasonably clear from Marcos's own words, is that the whole lot is going to go down, all of it. Whether he lives up to that is another question.
Fascinating. And so you mentioned earlier that the feeling on the ground was maybe not as pessimistic as you might have thought. You at the Inside Asian Gaming event very recently. I mean, is there anything else you picked up from that crowd that kind of surprised you, or you think hinted one way or the other at what's coming down the road? Well,
the first thing I would say to that is that, and which is linked to things I've observed in the past, including in print. PAGCOR, in its current manifestation, is one of the most accessible government departments in the Philippines. I mean, Alejandro Tenco and or his colleagues seem to appear at just about every event these days involving the industry, and that is to their credit. They are very accessible. I've spoken to a number of their people over the last year, and at this particular event, I spoke to Daniel Cecilio, who was the head of licensing for land-based operations, and he confirmed that the plan by PAGCOR to open a casinofilipino.com online operation for its own franchise or its own series of local casinos that would target not just local gamblers but also foreign gamblers, that foreign gambler plan has had to be cut off because they have interpreted that as being part of the Marcos crackdown. Now, that was an interesting thing for me because it suggested that PAGCOR actually does take this reasonably seriously. We cannot be privy, of course, to every executive meeting that PAGCOR is having, what Tenco is saying to his old buddy Marcos, because of invariably, the heads of PAGCOR are appointed by the president and are usually trustworthy lieutenants. And what's really going on, it's not quite clear, but I think it's fairly clear that the PAGCOR is going to concentrate on the privatization of its Casino Filipino properties. I should say licenses, not properties, because the properties are owned by other interests. And for that reason, I'm reasonably confident that PAGCOR don't have anything underhanded going on. What I do understand, though, is that there are people in the industry who are or were pogo licensees who are not panicking. There seemed to be a belief that maybe not all is as grim as it seems. Now, that stuff is yet to be established or verified, and I guess we will soon know. But for the moment, according to what PAGCOR is saying and doing, the licensed foreign-facing online operators are being shut down as we speak, and their Filipino employees are being relocated as best they can to other jobs, and their Chinese employees are being repatriated to a very uncertain fate, it should be said, because from the very beginning, the Chinese have been threatening their own nationals who have been working in the Philippines, even those who are licensed and allowed to do so by the Philippine government.
And so this is all happening in the context where already, because of Curacao, there were quite a few what you describe, I suppose, as sort of challenger jurisdictions popping up to try and service that kind of offshore licensing universe. Whether it's a harsher or less harsh version of a prohibition that Marcos eventually decides on, do you expect a certain exodus of business interests out of the Philippines to head to places like East Timor, Anjuan, etc.?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a key question, isn't it? Because there has to be an exodus in some form, and the reason for that, it's either an exodus or the gambling interest is simply going to change industries. But how is that likely? I mean, the exodus, such as it might be, has to take place because I cannot see the Chinese and ethnic Chinese controlled interests in the online side of a foreign-facing online industry. I cannot see them transferring to the domestic industry with ease. I think that would be a very difficult transition, and it would cause no amount of trouble, I think, among the existing licensees who themselves are already facing tougher regulatory environments, including not least the tax that is far more punishing than the foreign-facing people have had to pay. So then what it comes down to is a series of really tough decisions for the POGO licensees. We're going to move, obviously, if we don't stay in the Philippines and break the law. So where do we go? Do we go to the criminal environments of Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia? Do we try to go to Europe with all of the difficult cultural and technical complications that implies? Do we try the microstate emerging, or shall we say replenishing, online gambling licensing jurisdictions such as East Timor or Vanuatu or maybe Anjuan, or maybe some of the the smaller European haven type jurisdictions? It's really tough to say. Much of the POGOs are very they keep their noses to the ground. It's difficult to get information on what they want to do or what they're going to do. This is going to be a priority for us in the next few months, of course. But we'll soon know. I mean, our colleague Harrison Sayers is currently in Portugal with the gaming conference there, and the Vanuatu people have a stall and are aggressively drumming up business. East Timor is being a little bit circumspect about their promotions, but it's certainly happening in the industry, if not through media. And I can imagine that some of the some of the POGO operators in the Philippines will look to some of these more open, transparent regulators or new jurisdictions, rather than going for the opaque and ultimately illegal and difficult working environments, which some of their colleagues previously have attempted to do. There is also, of course, the United Arab Emirates, which we'll come to again in a moment, which appears to have set itself up with a regulated market for online gaming for both B2C and B2B. But again, there's a lot of questions left for the UAE, so we'll have to wait and see there. So difficult choices for the POGOs in the Philippines, but at least there are many choices. How that plays out, difficult to predict, but it's going to have an impact wherever they go. I think that we can be confident of.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's scoot around some of the rest of Asia Pacific in that case. Perhaps we could go to India next. I think we've spoken on this podcast about India many times before, maybe 3 or 4 versions of this conversation ago, we were thinking, well, there's obviously this various states going with their prohibitions, but there's these Supreme Court cases coming. Looks like the courts tend to side with the industry. Is kind of fairly positive. I mean, now some years on, we haven't had those judgments that we may be expected by now, and there's obviously been issues around tax. I mean, what is the situation in India for online gaming in its various forms?
It's a very again, it's volatile in its own way. But the problem with India compared to the Philippines, interestingly, is that the government seems to have really kind of broken its trust with the industry. For some time, you'll recall 2 years ago or so, we were looking with considerable interest at the the premier Indian think tank, policy think tank, communicating with people in the industry, looking up laws, trying to come up with a way of dealing with the increasing disjuncture between what was happening in the real world online in terms of players accessing gambling illegally, whether it be online, whether it be skill gaming or chance gaming, or sports betting particularly. And on the other hand, you had the Modi administration, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's administration, saying there is so much potential for gaming in the widest sense of the word because of all the technological brilliance that India offers and all of the money it can provide and invest in all the unicorns that are involved in this industry can advance this entire ecosystem. And for a period of time, it appeared that the skill-based gaming side of the industry, including the online side, was going to be embraced and brought in. And when it was declared last year, I believe, that the online skill gaming, which is to say the gambling side of gaming, was going to be allowed to regulate itself under, of course, ultimate jurisdiction from the government, but was going to regulate itself. Everyone looked at each other and thought, well, here we go. I mean, the lobbies for the online industry became very aggressive and very confident and attending conferences and speaking to government officials at federal and state levels. But after that, things started to fall apart a little bit. Part of that is because I think the industry wasn't quite as adept at lobbying governments as it could have been. But primarily, it appears the taboo of gambling came back to haunt the industry. And this was best expressed by the GST Council, which is a combination of federal, state, and union territory officials, economics or finance ministers, who would come together and hash out policies or problems that they have. And what they decided on at one point was that gambling, which is to say skill gaming, it's not defined as gambling in India, would receive the maximum 28% GST, which is bad enough. But not only that it would be applied to volume instead of revenue. And that was instantly for a good proportion of the industry, a kiss of death. Now, since then, the GST Council, under the urging of some of its members, a minority it should be said, as well as industry and a number of other analysts and so on, they've been urged to really reflect on this, because that making a decision to tax a company on the basis of volume when you've got that higher level of GST is really unrealistic. It points to an ignorance of the way the industry works and how the money flows. Since then, that original decision has been pared back somewhat by changing it from volume to initial deposits, which is kind of like a subset of volume. But it's still nonetheless punishing, and there's been a lot of closures of companies. Now, the major companies are still operating, and I think the worst case scenario did not come about. And nonetheless, the industry has also been bombarded with different parts of the government not being on the same page. On the one hand, you have the GST Council moving things around a bit. On the other hand, you have the taxation department making extraordinary farcical claims, back tax claims amounting in the billions of US dollars for single companies based on online gaming volume from years past. Craziness. While at the same time denying that the newly applied taxation law, denying that it was retrospective. So you can see here that the relationship between the government and the industry has not so much collapsed as kind of just shattered somewhat and is requiring a rebuilding. In the interim, the Enforcement Directorate, which is the main federal organization that deals with anti-money laundering and other financial crimes, has been cracking down on gambling, especially on payments channels and foreign companies that have been entering the Indian market to make good of this massive base of players. So there's pressure from them as well. However, it's the good news for the industry, along with the GST Council's walk back, is that the government is now, it appears, going to waive almost all of those back tax claims, in total, amounting to something like 15, I forget the number, 15 to $20 billion US, which is just utter madness. And in the meantime, as all of this goes on, the underground online industry is massive and is growing as India's 1.4 billion population moves toward a $900 million connectedness population on the internet. And so hovering all of this, as you point out, the Indian Supreme Court has two cases before it. In the case of its GST claim, it's an appeal by it's a government appeal basically against a state high court that found that a gambling company was being mistreated along these lines. And what we're effectively going to get from the Supreme Court is a ruling on whether the 28% GST on this definition of volume is constitutional. And if the court finds in the industry's favor, it could require a complete abandonment of everything we've seen in the last 6 months and a complete rewriting of taxation law for the industry. What that might lead to is a reconfiguration or a sort of reinvigoration of the industry. But I suspect that a good chunk of the sector will have already been burned, will struggle to find the capital to reopen old businesses. In any case, we can't be sure about that decision from the court, but I have to say, it would be astonishing. It would be really almost crazy if the Supreme Court went against every other decision, every other interpretation on this issue, on the basis of the legality of online skill gaming, and found against the industry. And the reason why this is relevant for the GST case is because, judging from the appeals of government departments against the industry, their interpretation appears to be that there's a gambling sort of subtext to this gaming that warrants the highest possible taxation rate. And I think on that basis, it's kind of an unfair treatment issue. There is, of course, the second, perhaps wider case that's before the court on the overall legality of online gaming. For me, that's a fait accompli. I can't see how the court could declare against the industry on that issue. But stranger things have happened. We'll see. But again, things have slowed down a lot in the last 6 months in India, as you'll notice if you look at our coverage of it in terms of legal developments and regulatory developments. But these two Supreme Court cases are absolutely key to what's going to happen in Indian gaming in the years to come.
Okay, in the interest of time, let's move on. Australia, if not your home for some time, at least the home of your accent. We could talk for hours about Australia, and I'd encourage anyone who wants to get a deeper understanding of that market to read Martin's piece on gambling compliance. I think if you type in Australia, a compliance cautionary tale, I believe is the title, you'll find that, and I'd encourage everyone to read that. It's a fantastic piece of work. But instead, in the few minutes afforded to you on this podcast, let's talk about Australia. I think we should probably lead off because it's the thing that's in the news the most, with a potential advertising ban, which is very much being bandied around at the moment. Where are we with that?
Okay. Well, again, it's not clear. I mean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has brought his kind of cautious and somewhat unclear style of leadership to the gambling industry as well on this particular issue. A year ago, a federal parliament committee unanimously declared that online gambling should be banned in phases within a few years. That was one of around 30 plus recommendations that, for the most part, was really quite punitive towards the industry. And these decisions were made in the context not just of a much more heightened awareness of problem gambling and the destructive effects of uncontained gambling on addicted people and on their families and so on, but also on the excesses of the industry itself, particularly in its exposure in mass media advertising and its perhaps unwise injection into live sports broadcasts and integrating sports betting odds with match commentary, stuff that has since been walked back in one of the many backlashes against the Australian gambling industry over the last 3 or 4 years, 5 or 6 years, in fact. That committee's 30 plus recommendations, we don't know exactly what's going to come of it. We do know the cabinet has met. It's not quite clear what they're going to do. However, Prime Minister Albanese seems to have made it quite clear that we are not going to get a full advertising ban after all. The precise rationale for that is not particularly clear or convincing. It will delight the industry, but there are going to be some punitive elements that are going to be there in their place. There appears to be a ban on online advertising on the way, as well as a further tightening of restrictions on when gambling advertising can take place in mass media, especially around live sporting events. Given the really sort of grim worst case scenario the industry was expecting, and the kind of acceptance that the main online gambling lobby in Australia, Responsible Wagering Australia, seemed to almost resignation it seemed to have been communicating in the last months before Albanese showed his hand, suggested that everything was, they were expecting all was lost, but that's not the case. So things are not things aren't looking so bad for the industry in Australia, but at the same time, and as I said in that report, the forces that have helped shape the current backlash are ever more empowered by everything that has happened. And any concession by a Labor government to an industry that makes so much of its money from Labor heartland electorates is going to find itself with a new battle at some point when new excesses are indulged in. And that is enhanced, that problem is made worse by the fact that the federal financial transactions anti-money laundering regulator, known as AUSTRAC, is now investigating pubs and clubs around the country because of money laundering issues involving slot machines, which, as I think everyone knows, one of the highest rates of slot machine use in the world. So the combination of all these elements means that this government, ahead of the federal election, is going to solve some of the problems now, kick the can down the road for some of the problems for the next government, which could be a minority government, and therefore facing even more instability down the track. As for the rest of the other 30 plus recommendations, I think we can be fairly confident that there will be no national licensing authority for corporate bookmakers. We will continue to see a state and territory-based licensing system, which will, of course, delight the Northern Territory, which has half of those licensees. There will be other smaller issues looked at, perhaps tighter issues on funding for research into gambling, which the academics will love. Because anything that allows them to get away from the Australian Research Council's monopoly on grants will delight them, and that will allow us, of course, to see many more academics at gambling conferences. But other than that, there are other, there are state-based issues that the industry is going to have to be very aware of, despite the fact that they've had some pullback in the federal arena. I would before I move to those just quickly, I want to mention two other things at the federal level that are concerning the gambling industry. The first is a promised crackdown on loot box classifications in computer games, video games, has been instituted. So the Federal Classification Authority, the Australian Classification Board, which has its decisions almost entirely outsourced for it by a coalition organization that does stuff around the world. Nonetheless, they have new criteria, which means that any kind of simulated gambling has a mandatory adult classification. Anybody under 18 can't use it. And anything involving a non-simulated gambling issue involving a loot box, where there is no real money involved, has a mandatory mature rating, which is advisory only. The other federal thing that we need to look at quickly is the online Keno loophole, which looks like it's about to be closed. So that will delight online lottery operators that would and corporate bookmakers that saw them as having an unfair advantage. On the state and territory level, particularly in New South Wales State and Victoria State, these regulators are getting more and more aggressive now. There's been a sea change in the structure of these organisations and in their personnel. We now have a commitment to very strong, very close, and it has to be said, I think, fairly predictable and reasonably honest engagement with the industry. But nonetheless, penalties are ramping, and any further relapses or serial breaches of legislation against incentives in gambling advertising for sports betting are likely to see much tougher penalties in future. And finally, again, I hate to use a four-letter word. It's been a real S show, shall we say, in Australia. And one of the worst examples of that has been yet another animal cruelty scandal, which has seen the head of the peak body in New South Wales for greyhound racing fall on his sword. And there's now a new investigation into cruelty against greyhounds. So just about every aspect of gambling in Australia is having a rinse through. By the time all this is over, I then pose the question, the take-home message for our viewers. When will this punitive phase be over? When will this punitive phase end so that a recovery phase can begin for the industry? Recovery for revenue, recovery for public credibility, recovery for the removal of fear of prosecution or regulatory harassment or whatever else. I don't think that moment of recovery, that change from one phase to the other is immediately before us. It's difficult to see when it can be. There are still massive fines on the way, particularly for Star Entertainment, the New South Wales, Queensland casino operator, which can expect hundreds of millions of dollars in fines from Austrac based on what they did to Crown Resorts. On top of that, of course, Star Entertainment's got lots of problems, as we wrote about today, with its $1.7 billion net loss for the last fiscal year. Despite getting a new $200 million debt facility, it's facing terrible issues. And just right across the board, Australia has been a real challenge for the industry. What used to be presented as best practice for the industry around the world, they've been brought down to earth with a severe thud.
I think, although that sounded like a lot of information, it does just scratch the surface of what's been going on in Australia. So would encourage everyone with an interest to go and check out the longer form. But in the interests of our diminishing time, let's jump to Thailand, I suppose. There's been excitement there around the prospect of integrated resorts and legislation in the works. What's the situation with casinos in Thailand?
Well, the encouraging thing for integrated resorts in Thailand, though they don't use that expression, but the encouraging news for people who don't follow Thailand so closely is that the legislation looks like it's going to pass quite easily. So what we're going to then ask of the Thais is some kind of systematic and sensible program for deciding where these resorts, I think around maybe up to 8 of them around the country was the number, if I'm not mistaken, where they're going to be located. If I recall correctly, Joe, there was going to be 3 in Bangkok, which for me, the critical question then becomes, are they going to cluster them or are they going to spread them around? Clearly, the lesson of Macau, to a lesser extent the Philippines in the Asian context is that clustering is valuable. And in the case of Bangkok, a cluster would make a lot of sense in the context of a city that has horrendous traffic. But the wider question, I think, and we won't go into the details of Thai legislation and whether the Thais will go down the same sorry road that the Japanese went down in terms of not taking industry warnings of inflexible legislation seriously. What I would suggest our readers concentrate on is something that I picked up again in Manila a few weeks ago from some people who have interest in Thailand. And that is, will the Thai government turn this into a kind of a protectionist industry in which foreign interests who have the most skill, the most ability, the most experience, the most potential to earn serious amounts of money and attract the most numbers of tourists, whether they're going to be forced to be minority players and be squeezed in terms of their contribution and the amount of money they can get out of that market. These are really sensitive issues in the context of a country that has very, very, very delicate politics, particularly of late, where just about any prime minister has to be very careful. I mean, if we look beyond the problems of years ago, where you had two major factions in the country vying against each other, the military-backed urban wealthy electorate going against the rural, more democratically minded people. These days, it's a little bit different, but the military still is very powerful. You've got a problematic royal family. And while there seems to be general consensus supporting this advancement of a gambling industry, a land-based gambling industry in Thailand, there are always weak spots that could undo things. And, the politics of Thailand is an underrated obstacle in my book. And we'll have to wait and see where things go. But for me, two main issues are: will there be clusters in Bangkok, which is where the real action will be, and will there be an unreasonable bias towards Thai corporate interests against the companies that can actually make Singaporean style, carefully run but highly lucrative operations. I should add too, in the context of Singapore, just quickly, Joe, something I omitted from saying in the Philippines, and I really the Philippines deserves to have added, and that is, notwithstanding all of the horrible things that have happened on the online side, the Philippines is now predicting $6 billion in gambling revenue for this financial year. Alejandro Tenco said as much 2 weeks ago in his keynote, and that basically ranks it up there with Singapore. But the Philippines is also expanding its market greatly on the back of its domestic-facing online activity, which is exploding, something like 500% year on year. So with all those factors in place, a place like Thailand has to understand that its rivals in the region are not just Macau and Singapore anymore. It's also the Philippines. And that's going to make things very interesting for the Thai government when it wants to ensure that it gets the best people applying, joining that tender for those casinos, for those licenses.
It'd be really fascinating to see how that all plays out. Japan, we are seeing a real acceleration of enforcement against what is sometimes charitably called a grey market. I'll never pass up the opportunity to point out that you saw this coming several years ago. So with that in mind, what's the situation in Japan? Is this going to accelerate even more?
Likely to do so. I sort of, with some humility, add that while we did, I think, reasonably accurately predict the direction that the regulatory problems in Japan would take, what we did not see, I don't think anybody really saw, was just how embedded the Japanese police were in investigating these problems much earlier than we thought was happening. Consequently, they are now, I think, in a much more advanced stage of investigating and potentially prosecuting people at all levels of the gambling ecosystem in Japan. I expect we will see a certain acceleration, but not too aggressive. This is, the Japanese tend to be more like a juggernaut. It starts small, it starts slow, but once it gets its momentum, it's really difficult to stop. And The Japanese are also, I think, much more mindful of things like consumer rights and human rights than many other Asian jurisdictions are. They're not going to be going, making human sacrifices on behalf of wowsers in the community. What they're going to be doing is trying to make sense of law enforcement in the absence of a legislature passing meaningful legislation. So in that environment, we can expect to see a balance, and that balance has already been communicated by the police. In part, they're going to crack down on all levels of the chain, starting from the local users, but probably the affiliates that have been the key link between users in Japan and foreign websites, and also the foreign websites themselves, in which Japanese police now have a very interesting interest, have a very extensive interest, and now investigating. However, the police have also made it clear that they're not going to be sort of picking up a scythe and beheading everyone they can see. What they're also doing is asking to speak to people who are users to learn what they're doing and why. I suspect it's much more about guiding the community rather than punishing it. So in this regard, most of the activity in Japan of late has been all about the underground. But one positive thing I've had from a meeting recently here in Taipei through some legal contacts is that there is an organization in Japan that brings industry and government together. They are looking to expand sports betting options, but possibly to include Japanese baseball, which would be a major development, which could also obviously expand into online gambling, online betting, which would be a most positive development for that side of the industry. But watch this space on that one. We're working on it.
Okay, well, let's close with the United Arab Emirates. I think perhaps the one of the most watched jurisdictions right now, partly out of potential economic interest, but also just because on a surface level seems so unlikely that they would embrace gambling regulation. There are more questions than answers, I would suggest, around the UAE at the moment in terms of how it's going to approach gambling. But what do we know at the moment?
Well, what we know about the UAE in general is that it has gone on a certain liberalizing trajectory in many parts of the community, of the judiciary, in terms of religion, and as well as tightening up on its money laundering detection and enforcement issues in order to regain trust with the European Union, as well as to keep its very steady and healthy relationship with the Financial Action Task Force. And these things have been going on for some time, which maybe for those in the know meant, and along with Wynn Resorts being on the ground for some time, meant that there was something coming. Those of us who sort of were suddenly taken by surprise maybe a few months ago were simply not, I think, sufficiently grounded to know that things were going to be this dramatic. But at the same time, the UAE remains something very different to a democracy. It is a series of emirates, and something like 80+% of the population of these places at any given time are foreign workers. It is a place that mixes and matches between Americans and Chinese and Russians, and of course Middle Eastern players. And in that environment, there are lots of questions that can't be asked, and therefore there are lots of questions. You can imagine the government regulator, which was formed last September, and which has already given out an impressive amount of information just a few months ago, nonetheless is very reluctant to talk to the media. They're happy to talk to business, they're happy to talk to the industry, but in terms of getting stuff on the record from them, it's still very difficult. What we can say, based on the information they've given, is that the online side is apparently proceeding much against what we might have predicted, even in a liberal environment. We also know, based on what Bill Hornbuckle said in recent days, that MGM is all in with Abu Dhabi in terms of going for an integrated resort there. Wynn Resorts, of course, have already got Ras Al Khaimah, the Emirate Ras Al Khaimah. Their operation there is already under construction. MGM also has interest in Dubai. In this environment, things are proceeding very positively. I would attest. But there's still so much left to understand of what's going on. It's going to require some trips there, I think, to talk to people on the ground. But all in all, the UAE is shaping up as an extremely interesting jurisdiction that is going to, in the gambling industry, as in so many other ways, is going to be playing different standards and playing different markets. But if it can really produce something of note in the global industry, it has a colossal market to unlock in the shape of Indian tourists who are 2 or 3 hours flight away, as well as, of course, but to a lesser extent, a more sensitive extent, much of the Middle East. And of course, Dubai and Abu Dhabi are burgeoning transfer points for travel between Asia, Australasia, and Europe. And particularly now that Russian airspace is closed and will be for the foreseeable future, the Middle East is an important, ever more important hub for people traveling from these long distances. I think if the situation remains unstable in terms of geopolitics into the future, you can see that part of the world is going to capitalize on this, and tourism is going to continue to skyrocket there. And the gambling industry is only going to be a beneficiary.
Yeah. Finally, there does seem to be, as far as the regulations are concerned, some space for online gambling. Another surprising development. What are you anticipating? That the regulator to issue hundreds of online gambling licenses in the near future, or what are we looking at?
Hundreds is unlikely. And the only reason I say that, there probably are many other reasons. The reasons I say hundreds is unlikely is because the UAE's one licensing decision to date that we're aware of is the formation of a lottery monopoly. They shut down 2 existing lotteries that had been operating for some time without any controversy, and replaced it with an organization that no one outside of the UAE has ever heard of, and whose experience in the field may not be particularly great. So if they can't have a competitive lottery market, what's the chance that they're going to have a super competitive online market? I think that perhaps would be, maybe pushing things a little too far. On the other hand, again, if you read the literature on the regulator's website, it appears that they've got a very conscientious and they've been thinking very carefully about how to put space there for an online industry if and only if one or more of the Emirates approve. Now, all of this, of course, rides on approval from individual Emirates. And you can imagine that if the regulator has produced this in writing, you have to assume that at least one Emirate and the federal government have agreed, in principle, that this is allowable. I imagine that we would see something like what New Zealand is promising, which is a small number of competitive licensees. Whether that would apply to B2B only or B2C, which the text appears to also accommodate, it's not clear. One thing is for sure, the regulator will tell us in their own good time exactly when they're ready. And one can't complain as long as they are consistent with what they say. And to date, they have been absolutely consistent.
Fascinating stuff. Martin, thank you so much for all that.
My pleasure, Joe.
Thank you very much indeed to Martin. As we mentioned during our conversation, gambling compliance subscribers can find Martin's long-form piece, Australia, a compliance cautionary tale, on our website. Either head to the Australia country page or type that headline into our search bar. Similarly, you'll find the Asia Pacific Outlook under the resources and guides section of our website, which features lots more insights from Martin and the rest of the team. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. The Gambling Compliance Podcast is hosted by Joe Ewins. In this episode, I was speaking to Martin Williams. The producer is Jack Halliday.